Welcome to this afternoon's American Security Project webinar. This is an on-the-record conversation that will be available for attribution. A recording of this conversation will be posted on our website. All audience members will be muted during the discussion, but please use the Q&A box at the bottom of your screen to ask any questions to the panelists. With that, Patrick, over to you.
Thank you, Tucker. Good afternoon from Washington. I'm Patrick Costello, the CEO of the American Security Project. Welcome to today's conversation. Last month, NATO leaders met in Madrid for what was arguably the most important NATO summit in generations. There were a number of noteworthy developments in Madrid and alliance firsts, not the least of which was the release of the new strategic concept. For years, the alliance has been seen as increasingly irrelevant, but the war in Ukraine has energized NATO and given it a renewed sense of purpose in the face of a revanchist Russia. The summit and new strategic concept serve to prepare the alliance for a much more challenging and potentially darker future. Joining us this afternoon to discuss the recent summit, the strategic concept, and NATO's next act is Ambassador Doug Lute. Ambassador Lute had a distinguished 35-year career in the United States Army. He spent 6 years in the White House during 2 administrations. From 2007 to 2009, he served as Deputy National Security Advisor for Iraq and Afghanistan to President George W. Bush. During the first term of the Obama administration, he served as coordinator for South Asia. During the second Obama term, he was the United States Permanent Representative to the North Atlantic Council, NATO's standing political body. During this period, he was instrumental in designing and implementing the alliance's response to a variety of security challenges in Europe and in the Middle East. To our guests on the line, throughout today's conversation, please feel free to use the chat function or Q&A function to submit your questions, and I'll work to weave them in. But Ambassador Lute, thank you so much for joining us. Let's go ahead and get started. Perhaps the most notable departure between where we were in 2010 when the last strategic concept was released and where we are today is that in the 2010 strategic concept, it called for a true strategic partnership between NATO and Russia. And now Russia is recognized as the most significant and direct threat to the Allies' security and to peace and stability in the Euro-Atlantic area. So how do you assess the alliance's response to Russia's aggressive actions in Ukraine? And do you have concerns about alliance cohesion, particularly as we start to approach the colder winter months and we have a sharper focus on European energy security?
Right. Well, first of all, it's good to be with the American Security Project today. And I think by way of context, it's important to recognize that this is only the 7th strategic concept in the over 70-year history of the alliance. And roughly that math kind of leads us to once a decade, NATO updates its strategic concept. And as you mentioned, the last one was 2010, and it was a dramatically different strategic setting. In 2010. And as you say, the 2010 concept even imagines the potential for a strategic partnership with Russia. And of course, that looks very much out of date today. I think the strategic concept, which was agreed just last month, is a very significant response to the Russian invasion of Ukraine. And we could talk about the NATO force posture changes that it outlines, but it's a very strategic and I think significant response. You know, overall, Putin is betting that he can outlast not only Ukraine, but the supporting coalition led by us, led by the United States, and of course, the NATO member states are all part of that supporting coalition, providing military assistance, humanitarian assistance, and so forth. Putin thinks time is on his side. And he thinks he can withstand the combination of battlefield attrition in Ukraine, and his forces are suffering heavy attrition, the political isolation on the international stage, and the sanctions regime, longer than Ukraine and Western supporters can withstand Ukrainian attrition on the battlefield, and disruptions in supply chains, both energy and food, which we can talk about, and finally the resulting inflation across the Western coalition. So this is very much a contest of durability, and he's betting that he's got the long game advantage. So we'll see. Your question about cohesion, I mean, we'll see. I mean, he has certain advantages with regard to withstanding these pressures that we as a democracy don't have. I think on the NATO front, it would be very important to track the delivery of the promises in the strategic concept and the promises coming out of the Madrid summit communique. And we could talk about those force posture changes. Some of them are quite ambitious. So it'll be interesting to watch the move from concept in Madrid to practice on the ground. And I believe NATO will deliver, but it won't be easy because, as I say, these are some ambitious changes. I think much more critical, though, will be the contest that you mentioned, which is the ability of especially our Western European allies to withstand the energy crisis, which is just now unfolding. You know, the European Union took the step with regard to denying Russian export of oil, but that was a relatively minor piece of the European energy equation. Much more significant is European reliance on Russian natural gas. And they've had a much harder time reaching consensus in the EU in terms of what to do with that dependence on what is now obviously an unreliable supplier. So as we move from July to December, I think this question about European natural gas imports will be the key assault, if you will, the key potential fissure on cohesion. And that's the one to watch.
Great, thank you. You mentioned posture changes several times. There were substantial changes agreed to in NATO military posture in Madrid. Battle groups in Eastern Europe are getting bigger, going from battalions to something closer to brigade size. And the idea is that these wouldn't necessarily be tripwire forces as they were in the past, but a more robust line of defense. So if you could just provide your thoughts on this bolstering of defensive posture.
Right. So I think the combination of the war in Ukraine and now NATO's response, it will in effect reset the deterrence equation, the conventional deterrence equation in Europe for a decade plus. This is going to be a substantial, durable change in deterrence in Europe. And you know, I think before we get to what NATO's going to do, I think we should appreciate that part of that deterrence equation is what has happened to Russian conventional forces, and they have suffered very significant, heavy attrition in the war in Ukraine at the hands of the Ukrainians. So part of this equation, of course, is that Russian conventional capability has diminished over time, and it will take the Russian military, at least in my view, a decade to try to rebuild. And remember, the last time they claimed to have rebuilt in the run-up to the war in Ukraine, the product they got from that 10-year effort to rebuild their conventional forces hasn't proven very impressive on the battlefield, right? It's got some fundamental weaknesses, especially in terms of the quality of the force. So the Russian half of this ledger sheet, if you will, has, I think, diminished by way of their substantially lousy performance in Ukraine. Now, what about the other side of the ledger? What about the NATO side of the ledger sheet? And essentially, as your question suggests, NATO is changing models of deterrence. So let me rewind the tape a little to explain this. So after the 2014 seizing of Crimea, illegally annexing of Crimea by Russia, and then the destabilizing of the Donbass, NATO deployed forces in the years just after 2014 into the northeast corner of the alliance. So the 3 Baltic states and Poland, where they had never been before, right? So the last Russian invasion, the 2014 invasion, resulted in NATO force posture changes as well. And in each of those 4 northeastern corner states, if you're still with me geographically, right, NATO deployed a multinational combat battalion. So think about a reinforced battalion, 800 to 1,000 troops in Estonia, Latvia, Lithuania, and Poland. On top of that, the US, back after 2014, committed a heavy brigade, an armor brigade, on a rotational basis into Poland, and an aviation brigade, helicopter brigade, into Poland as well. So there was a substantial force increase after 2014. But the model of deterrence there was a model of punishment.
Mhm.
not denial. So let me take us back to Thomas Schelling, right? This sort of the father of modern deterrence theory. He argued there are two types. You could, on the one hand, affect your potential opponent's calculus by arguing that, look, you can attack, but if you do, we will exact a very high price. We will punish you for attacking, and you may even achieve your objectives. Think overrunning a Baltic state with very, very little strategic depth. But we will punish you and we will take it back. We will regain that ground. So that's the model of deterrence by a threat of punishment. NATO has shifted from that model to now a model of denial. And here, the deterrence threat sounds like this. We will deny you the ability to achieve your objectives, right? So that has meant that we have to bolster those reinforced battalions in the northeast corner of the alliance up to reinforced brigades. So it's sort of a threefold increase in terms of combat power in the Baltic region down to Poland. We will also put, in an effort to bolster deterrence, on a permanent basis, a U.S. Corps headquarters in Poland. This is significant because of permanent, right? The other forces will still be rotational. They won't be the same forces there forever. But this Corps headquarters will be located in a fixed facility, and it'll be there for the long term. We will also pre-position further American equipment. Think in terms of a U.S. heavy division worth of equipment in pre-positioned sites. This is reminiscent of the Cold War pre-positioning that we had. We will move high-end air defense and precision long-range fires into Germany, able to reinforce. And then perhaps most ambitious, NATO took the decision that it would move from a relatively modest reinforcing capability after 2014 to now an announcement by the Secretary General, which quite frankly surprised me, and I'm going to watch very carefully here, an announcement that NATO would have 300,000 response forces. I got to tell you, this is the one that for me, I'm going to have to see this to believe it. The 300,000 troops is a lot, and if you unpack the 300,000 response force pledge, the most ready of that 300,000 is the first tranche of 100,000. And that is designed to be, those 100,000 are designed to be movable, alertable, movable, ready, if you will, in 10 days notice. That is a very substantial force. So we'll see. I think time will tell whether NATO can actually generate that very ambitious response force. Now, if that were not enough, then U.S. alone took some other significant steps. We have 4 Aegis destroyers today in Rota, Spain, and the Biden administration announced that would be plussed up by 2 more. So we're going to go from 4 to 6 Aegis destroyers. These are important because they're dual purpose warships, right? They carry not only long-range cruise missiles, but they carry significant Aegis air defense and missile defense capability as well. So that's important. And then equally impressive, they've added 2 squadrons of F-35s to the US Air Force presence in the UK, in the United Kingdom. So those are significant sort of forces in depth of the alliance, which really, I think, increased the deterrence capability. So look, when you add that up, these are substantial changes. And not only to the Northeast, I should have mentioned, to the Southeast of the NATO geographic picture. We will add 4 battalions to Slovakia, Hungary, Romania, and Bulgaria. And the US promised, on top of that NATO commitment of 4 battalions, the US promised another rotational brigade in Romania. So if you look at this strategically, one of the concerns Putin announced up front was his concern that NATO was moving to Russia's border. Right. And of course, before 2014, we weren't on his border, and then we went there modestly. And now after 2022, we're going to be there in strength. So he's managed to achieve exactly what he cited as wanting to avoid. And that's a pretty perverse strategic approach.
One of the more permanent changes we might be seeing to the alliance is through expansion. So we know that Finland and Sweden are in the process of being admitted into NATO. I believe the United States Senate is poised to act this week on legislation to approve their joining. So what does adding Finland and Sweden mean for NATO's deterrent powers in Northern Europe, particularly around the Baltic Sea? It could take upwards of a year for them to formally be admitted into the alliance. So your just thoughts on the deterrent powers in Northern Europe, and also some of the benefits and drawbacks of them joining the alliance.
All right, well, first of all, this is a significant move. And again, it's absolutely the reverse of what Putin cited as a reason for his concerns, right? Is that NATO was moving closer to his border. Well, now he's going to have an additional 800-mile border with NATO when Finland joins. So he will have, by way of his invasion of Ukraine, roughly double the length of the land border between NATO and Russia. So again, not a great strategic move on his part. Look, I think it's important to recognize there are essentially three steps to NATO enlargement. There is the national decision by Sweden and Finland to actually apply or notify NATO they wish to join, right? And in every instance, so we're at 30 allies today. With these two, we'd be at 32, obviously. In every one of those instances, it has started with a national decision. So NATO doesn't recruit anyone. Nations come to the open door of NATO, not the reverse. The second step is that NATO accepts that application. And that's the step that took place at the Madrid summit. So the 30 current allies reached consensus and said, okay, we welcome you, Sweden and Finland. And now we're into the third step. And this means that all of the 30 existing allies have to ratify, by way of their national constitutions, essentially the change to the original Washington Treaty, the 1949 treaty. So they have to add essentially an addendum, a protocol, it's called, to the Washington Treaty. And that has to be done by consensus in each one of the 30 capitals. So as you mentioned, here in Washington, that's happening by way of a Senate vote, when the Senate has to reach 2/3 majority to actually modify the Washington Treaty, which all the way back in 1949 was ratified at 2/3 majority. Right, so that process is underway. The one asterisk I'd put on that process before I leave you with this sort of three-step process is that, of course, this means that President Erdogan of Turkey has another bite at this apple.
Right.
You'll recall that before Madrid, when NATO agreed on step 2, that Turkey raised objections with regard to Sweden and Finland, in particular, Swedish support or perceived support for the PKK Kurdish militant group that, of course, is a existential enemy of Turkey. That got ironed out, and we made our way through step 2, the acceptance of the invitation. But Erdogan will have another bite at this. So we'll have to see exactly what concessions President Erdogan might try to eke out of this opportunity as we proceed down the ratification path. Militarily, this is a very significant add to the addition to the alliance in a number of ways. So not only are Sweden and Finland both mature democracies, I mean, nobody's going to be concerned here about their democratic values and so forth, as opposed to some other recent additions to the alliance where maybe you see some democratic backsliding. Think Turkey, Hungary, even Kaczynski's Poland, right? So they're mature democracies. They also bring significant advanced military capabilities to the table. I mean, both of them have very meaningful, up-to-date sort of 5th-generation military forces that really add substantial capability to the collective defense arsenal of NATO. Geographically, they are very important additions. So not only do they further secure the Baltic Sea region and by way of Sweden and Denmark, the access to the Baltic Sea, but if you think further north, they also open up NATO access to the Barents Sea. in a very interesting and strategic way, especially as the far north gains more and more attention with regard to ice-free potential transit through the Arctic area. So this is a very significant political, military, and I think geographic addition to the alliance. And I hope it goes smoothly. But again, we'll need to watch President Erdogan's next move.
Great, thank you. Within NATO, there had been some division over whether the alliance is part of the bedrock of the current international order and thus has a global role, or whether it's a more regionally focused security organization. This question appears to have been resolved in favor of a global reach, as the leaders agreed to categorize China as a principal challenge, yet another novel thing within the strategic concept. I think it's also notable that several leaders from Indo-Pacific nations attended the summit in Madrid. So, Doug, in your view, has NATO evolved from a regional security alliance to an alliance with global reach and responsibility?
So I don't think so. And here's why. I mean, first of all, NATO itself, obviously by just the name, it's focused on the North Atlantic. So I don't believe that NATO, the 30 current members of the alliance, would ever reach consensus to launch a NATO military presence or a military operation outside of the North Atlantic area, unless Article 5, the mutual defense clause, were actually activated. In fact, we have a recent historical example of that by way of the NATO operation, longstanding operation in Afghanistan, right? Which was triggered by the Article 5 decision as a result of the Al-Qaeda attacks 9/11 here in the United States. So it's not that NATO has no history in operating outside of its geographic boundaries, but it takes a significant step, like in the case of 9/11, Article 5, the invocation of Article 5, or the case of the Balkan Wars, in particular in Bosnia and Kosovo. Here you have a conflict or a stability operation that's on the boundary of the alliance itself. It's in the neighborhood, right? So NATO has some experience in sort of outside of the specific North Atlantic area, but they're taken very judiciously. And remember, all of those decisions, so 9/11, Bosnia, and Kosovo, were taken at consensus inside the alliance. I don't believe there's political consensus today to extend NATO's military capabilities out into the Indian Ocean or the Indo-Pacific region. I don't think that that's politically viable, especially not when there's war in Europe. So I think that I don't think this is imminent, that there's some sort of military operation that would extend into the beyond the North Atlantic area. What NATO does do, though, however, by way of the strategic concept, and for the first time ever, the word China appears in the strategic concept, right? And essentially here, what NATO is accomplishing is increasing awareness of Chinese influence, global influence for sure, and the rise of China, especially as an economic power, as an aspiring political power, perhaps as a challenger to the rules of the road in terms of how the world operates. So think here the WTO and so forth, right? But what NATO is really appreciating is the extent of that Chinese influence that has already reached the European continent, right? And what do I mean by that? I mean that NATO is now more aware of the commercial influence, the Chinese buying up of transportation infrastructure, the challenge of Huawei and the mass communications network, financial reliance on Chinese financing and so forth, which really is the logical extension of the Belt and Road Initiative, right? I mean, if you plot the Belt and Road Initiative on a global map, right, on a table, and you say, well, what's the purpose here? I think the destination of the Belt and Road Initiative is the 1/4 of global GDP in Europe, right? The marketplace of Europe is, in my view, the geographic destination of the Belt and Road Initiative. It's not, look, it's not the souk in Turkmenistan, right? That's not why they built the Belt and Road Initiative. So, and you see this playing out. I mean, the Greek deep sea port of Piraeus is owned and operated today by the Chinese. I've mentioned already that the challenge of Huawei and buying up not only 5G mass communications networks, but many of the 3 and 4G networks existent today in Europe are based on Huawei technology. And look, why is China doing this? Well, it's doing this in part because they're good investments, right? I mean, they're good commercial investments. But in the Chinese model, behind the commercial investment, beyond the commercial investment, is an expectation that there will be a political payoff down the road, that there'll be political influence by way of these commercial investments. We're beginning to see this play out in some cases in the European Union and elsewhere. So this is what NATO intends to do. It intends to be much more aware, and it intends to be cautious that Chinese investment in commercial infrastructure may have a security dimension, because many of these commercial infrastructures are really dual purpose infrastructure. So the Greek port of Piraeus has a commercial private capacity, but the Greek port of Piraeus is potentially also a naval port. 5G communications, you can imagine that those are both civil and military. So what NATO really needs to do, and here the NATO partnership with the European Union is very important, that these two institutions need to work hand in hand to be more aware of Chinese infiltration, if you will, and then if possible, put some limits on it, especially when it begins to have security implications. But that doesn't mean that you now see NATO ships sailing the Indian Ocean.
Great, thank you. We've got a limited amount of time left, and I want to pivot to yet another novel element within the strategic concept, and that is climate. And the strategic concept identified climate change as, quote, the defining challenge of our time. I think this marks quite a change from the last time NATO updated its guiding principles in 2010. So can you tell us how NATO is framing this challenge around climate change, which, as the report says, threatens operations in every domain?
Well, so far, Patrick, it's much more conceptual than it is anything that's practical, right? I mean, the strategic concept lays out a net zero objective by 2050, but that's in line with other international calls. The strategic concept outlines how NATO should be the standard bearer. It should be the example of how to account for the climate impacts on military operations. Okay, that's fine. But what exactly does that mean in practice? Frankly, it's much more conceptual than it is something we can actually hang our hats on. And we'll have to see. I mean, I think in today's political climate, NATO had to say something in the strategic concept about climate, which a significant number of the 30 current members consider even more dangerous than perhaps the war in Ukraine. So there had to be mention of this, but I didn't find anything there that was so substantially reassuring. And we'll have to just see. And remember, there's I think nearly 50 points, 50 paragraphs in the strategic concept. So it covers the waterfront, right? It covers the waterfront from Russia to climate. And so it's a very ambitious document. And as I said at the outset, it'll very much depend, I think, as years go on. Is NATO capable of actually connecting the concepts laid out in the strategic concept to practice? And that's what we should all be watching carefully.
You know what, that takes us up to the 12:30 mark, and I think that's honestly a perfect spot for us to conclude this conversation and hopefully tee up another conversation in the not too distant future. Ambassador Lute, truly a pleasure and an honor to have you on. Thank you so much for taking the time. To our guests on the line, thank you as well for joining us, but that is all the time we have for today.
Okay, thanks very much.
Thank you, sir.